Hello and welcome to Connect and Collaborate, and we have a very special show today. It is the last in our series of Finding Colorado's Next Governor, and I have with me in studio Ed Sealiver from Denver Business Journal. How you doing, Ed?
Great, thanks for having me again.
Fantastic. I have Jeff Wasden by phone. He's actually in Salt Lake City right now at the Western Pathways Conference. Jeff, how are you?
I'm doing absolutely wonderful. The conference is going great, but this conversation with Congressman Polis and our partnership with Ed and DBJ on this series was important for me to sneak out and join the call today.
Appreciate it. And of course, we have Congressman Jared Polis in with us today. How are you, Jared?
I am wonderful. Hello, everybody.
Well,
Jared,
welcome.
it's great to have you on the phone with me and have you there in studio and get this conversation. You are the last of our series as we get ready for a fast approaching primary.
Jeff, when I arrived in the studio, there was a guitar waiting for me on one of the chairs. Apparently, Gail, our mutual friend, had left a guitar from Peter Yarrow, who is celebrating his 80th birthday today, that he wanted our help in donating that to the Smithsonian Museum. It's a Puff the Magic Dragon guitar. So that's what greeted me, and I was a little bit surprised, I have to admit. I was expecting you.
You're the first candidate who has gotten a guitar for coming on to us.
That is very true.
We're definitely not showing any preference, but that's a great welcome to the COBRT
and a happy birthday to Peter Yarrow, wherever you are.
Yes, absolutely.
Love that. Well, Jared, let's just jump right in. We've obviously had an incredible opportunity to work with you in your current role in Congress on some significant issues. One I'm in Utah for on education and workforce, another on immigration. We'll have a chance to get into those and talk about some of the pressing issues in this governor's race facing the state. Ned and I will bounce back and forth on some questions. But I just want to start first and foremost to the listeners across the state of Colorado that may not be as familiar about you, your platform, why you're decided to run, your background as those maybe in CD2 that you've been working with as your constituents. So just share a little bit with the listeners, Jared, about you, your personal background.
Yeah, and hopefully your listeners up our way in Fort Collins and Broomfield and Boulder and the mountain communities know me well, but I'm, of course, been introducing myself to the rest of the state about what a forward, future-looking governor with bold ideas can bring. I started my first company in college. It was called American Information Systems. It was an internet access provider. That was back in 1993, dial-up internet access. I started with two friends I met through college. We raised capital. We grew that business. We sold that business in 98. I started proflowers.com and bluemountain.com. Bluemountain.com, electronic greeting cards, proflowers.com. Blue Mountain was 96, Proflowers was 98. We sold bluemountain.com in 99. Proflowers actually went public in 03. Only time I've taken a company public. I wouldn't recommend that to my friends, but it worked out fine for us. We were traded publicly for a number of years before we were acquired by Liberty Media. Along the way, while I was out of the day-to-day role on those companies and, in board or chairmanship type roles or advisory roles or roles as a major shareholder, I also was a co-founder of Techstars, now in several dozen cities, started in Boulder, of course, which is an accelerator for entrepreneurs. When we started it, it was 10 that we would accommodate for a 2 or 3 month period every summer and help them get to the point where they could raise capital and fly on their own wings. And I was proud also to start a nonprofit through Techstars that we since spun out, Patriot Boot Camp, that works with our returning veterans to help get veterans the skills they need to be self-employed or to be entrepreneurs themselves. We saw a large gap there. There were a lot of programs that worked with veterans to align their job skills to work and for training, but we didn't see any programs out there that helped them become self-employed or start their own businesses. So we started Patriot Boot Camp, and I'm proud that we've trained hundreds of veterans to this day. In addition, I've started other companies along the way. Cinema Latino, the only first-run Spanish movie theater in the Denver metro area. I started nonprofit public charter schools, New America School, and Academy of Urban Learning. I was superintendent of New America School for several years before I ran for Congress, and I also served 6 years on the State Board of Education. Education is my passion. It's a big part of what our state does, almost half the state budget. I think it's great to have a governor with the skill set, the creativity, the innovation, to know that we can do better in our schools. And we're highlighting the need for early childhood education, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But we also have a lot of great ideas for aligning our schools to workforce needs, making college more affordable, and doing a better job through really the P-12 system.
Excellent.
Jared, thanks for that. And Ed's going to jump in with a question here, but you made the decision to leave Congress and run for governor. Talk a little bit about that before Ed takes over with their next issue question.
Well, I think I'm an executive at heart. I certainly have enjoyed my time in Congress. I think it'll make me a more effective governor. I've been able to learn to work with Republicans and Democrats to get things done in what, frankly, is even a more hyper-partisan environment in Washington than we have in Denver. And I enjoyed the experience of, first working alongside President Obama, being part of passing landmark legislation, and then, of course, taking on President Trump when he goes after our immigrant communities or whoever he's going after that day. But, again, I sort of long for the responsibility and authority that will allow me to get the work done rather than just talk about it, which is what Congress seems to endlessly do. I, of course, have experience in an executive agency of state government, having chaired the State Board of Education, the business experience, and know enough about the political process to get things done. So, I'll have been there 10 years. I always say that we should send people to Congress long enough to make a difference, but not so long as to be part of the problem. And I wanted to make sure I was an example of that, too. The last thing I would have wanted to have done would be to stay longer than I would offer fresh and new ideas to that body.
Well, speaking of fresh and new ideas, I think anybody who listens to your 3-minute bio will pick out the idea of your entrepreneurship in your career. So let's talk a little bit about what does Colorado need? I know you've talked about wanting to support Colorado's entrepreneurship economy. What does it need to do to improve it? What changes would you make as governor?
So we've come a long way in the last 2 decades since I was starting out. When I was starting out, we didn't really even have what today we might call startup infrastructure. We didn't have co-working space. There was even less access to capital than there was today. I was, involved in certainly some of the very first, angel funding networks were put together, in the 90s, but nothing like the degree of sophistication that any of that exists with today. I'm excited when I look at the state of entrepreneurship across our state. I think it's been highlighted, and it's certainly successful in the Denver, Boulder, Fort Collins metro area. I think among the larger needs in that area are, of course, we want more homegrown capital. We still need to do more to attract more capital to our state. And that means capital based here for early stage, venture stage, growth stage, and of course the quality of life. And I'm sure we're going to get into issues around infrastructure and higher ed and all those. But of course those relate to successful innovation ecosystems. Now, as I go across Western Colorado, I'm excited again by the progress that they've made. Just this last week I was in a new co-working space in Delta. We have proximity in Montrose, Grand Junction. The Telluride Foundation has underwritten a effort to expand entrepreneurship, which they see as a vertical market that Telluride can compete in that area. So I think there's great potential for really, places that people from across the country want to come to live, to deploy their creativity and their ideas. And we just need to make sure we have the right startup infrastructure to allow that to happen right here in Colorado.
So I want to shift the conversation to something that certainly nationally has been a staple of the new Trump administration, and that's regulatory reform and trying to improve businesses' ability to continue to grow, expand, create more jobs. Colorado's been a struggle. There's certainly been a 6-7 year process of trying to bring some pretty basic common sense regulatory reform bills forward that have met a partisan fate. Jared, how do we find the right balance, the correct balance between public safety, protection of the workforce, and inhibiting some of those roadblocks that are putting direct costs and negative impacts to business?
Well, I would have a collaborative approach to really solicit ideas from businesses about what's getting in their way of growth. I think for too long, big businesses and corporations have co-opted government for subsidies and to give themselves an unfair advantage against against disruptive businesses, small businesses, and entrepreneurs. So I would be excited to hear what we can do to get out of the way of innovation and creativity for small businesses. And I'm a good listener. I have more town halls than any other member of Congress from Colorado. I will continue to be around the state listening to our small businesses to see what we can do to reduce their costs and allow them to thrive.
Okay, so nothing that you're coming in with in particular, but just wanting to hear what people say is the problem.
Well, I mean, in small businesses I started, I haven't run into any issues with the state that would have caused us any issues. I run retail businesses, which are messy, not just the Cinema Latino Theater, but I've also been a minority partner in a couple failed restaurants. They always say if you're looking for a good way to make a small fortune, start with a large fortune and open a few restaurants. No, but it was a hobby. For some who were able to make it work, it's amazing. But no, I mean, I've been generally happy with where we've done in Colorado, but obviously other small businesses have their own story. So if they're frustrated about a state law, let me know, and we'll see if we can cut some red tape and make sure they're not at a disadvantage compared to large corporations.
Excellent. Well, all right. So speaking of people might be frustrated about a state law, let's start out broad here, and then I'm gonna follow up probably with a little something more specific. What does energy policy look like under a Polis governorship? How is it different than the state's current energy policy? Well, certainly under Bill Ritter and John Hickenlooper, we've made great progress towards renewable energy goals. The voters have put in place a 30% renewable energy standard. My goal as governor is to put our state on the trajectory to achieve true energy independence with 100% renewable energy by 2040 to power the grid, including, of course, the investor-owned utilities, the municipal utilities, and the rural electric co-ops. I think Colorado should be in the forefront to innovate, get good green jobs that can't be outsourced, and really show that we can get it done along with other states that are leading the way. It's not just something that can be done at the state level and from the top down. And I'm excited to say we have communities across our state stepping up. I think we're up to 11 municipalities that have committed to 100% renewable energy by 2035 or 2030. Pueblo County recently joined them, committing to 100% renewable energy by 2035. So it's really a partnership that I think we as Coloradans can take pride in, not only doing our part on climate, cleaner air, but also better sustainability for rates and more lower rates over time and stability over time, which I think will give energy-intensive manufacturing a competitive advantage in our state. So I think people know you very well as a renewable energy candidate. We have a few people, I'm sure, from the energy industry who are listening in right now. For a guy who has come out and supported increased regulations in the state energy, who has at one point said he's glad his congressional district isn't the heart of the energy industry area, why should people in the oil and gas industry not be fearful of a Polis governorship? Well, I think what people in the oil and gas industry are fearful of is the market, and it's a commodity, and we actually have good pricing right now. So they are making a lot of money. If oil were to return to $30 or $40 a barrel, and they would be in a lot of pain. I don't think the governor of Colorado has any say in what those commodity prices are. Any state use of oil is de minimis. Natural gas, I'm learning more about. It's possible there's some pricing implication, especially without infrastructure. But again, I would argue it's pretty small. Largely, these are international commodities, and that's certainly, if I was in the oil and gas industry, that's what I'd wake up every day worried about. And I'm sure many of them are hedging to reduce their risk over the long term.
Jared, to that point, and certainly piggybacking on the theme I brought in with regulation, how do we balance and weigh the local jurisdictions versus a statewide policy? And what would you, if elected governor, view local authority, local control on oil, gas, and the industry versus a statewide approach?
So I've been working on this issue for years, Jeff. We came very close. We worked with Governor Hickenlooper to try to get some model legislation around local control in a special session of the legislature a few years ago. We did have the support of numerous environmental groups, local governments, I think 7 or 8 oil and gas companies. And I think it needs to be done. We need that certainty around the legal parameters of local control. I don't think it behooves our communities frankly, nor does it behoove operators to always wind up in the courts not knowing what will happen. So we look forward to working with local communities and others and the legislature to establish more definitive parameters around local control.
And how does that work, though, with to an industry that has done such a great job in the state of really with one of the toughest regulations that certainly provides some great paying jobs for the workforce? And I know Ed's going to follow up with some workforce questions. The patchwork regulations of every community across the state looks different to give local authority. You're basically have an industry that doesn't want to play ball in Colorado, and I think it would drive industry out of state if we allowed that local control to that level. So just
well, Jeff,
your reaction to that.
I think the premise of your question is wrong. There is local control today. And that's why counties have vastly different approaches to drilling. I mean, you can't argue that it's the same in a Weld County or Broomfield or a Boulder County. They're very different. I think what's lacking is the predictability and stability that all stakeholders want around exactly the local control parameters. It always, not always, but almost always winds up in the courts, and oftentimes, courts will side with whichever side, can argue the precedence is on the side. There's good precedents like Bowen versus Edwards that have argued for local control, and there's others that have argued for the state interest, which of course is one of the stakeholders as well. So if anybody thinks that we can't do better, I would encourage them. I'd say it's a failure of creativity, a failure of the imagination. Of course we can do better. And that's what I'm going to work on as governor.
Great. Well, I think... Sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I was just going to... It's a segue, Ed, to set you up as we shift into workforce. With the idea, Jared, of a 2040 100% renewable... shifting to the workforce, what do you do? How do you tell the folks in those industries that may be trained, that may be their passion, that have been involved in that industry for 20, 30 years, what that looks like? How do you support them? It's a national discussion around trade and industry that we're dealing with right now as you start looking at the threats of autonomous vehicles, of the trucking industry. A renewable 100% mandate certainly is going to impact the workforce.
Well, yeah, I mean, here we've had all of our discussions around the energy sector, and of course we're excited about the good green jobs that can't be outsourced, and of course we're excited about making sure that we have 700 jobs in Vestas today making wind turbines in Pueblo. We have income for farmers that are leasing out their property for solar and wind projects, and we have a lot of great ideas about how we can achieve that at polisforcolorado.com. But obviously the workforce is a lot more complicated than just those jobs. We need to do a better job aligning opportunities for high school students through apprenticeships or certificates to have the skills they need to be able to succeed in today's and tomorrow's workforce. And what that might mean for students who are going on to a four-year university, can they get some transferable and aligned dual or concurrent enrollment credit while they're in high school, so they only need 3 or even 2 years to finish up a four-year degree. And if they're not going on to college, can they graduate with an associate's degree from high school or a welding certificate, or at least the ability to get a good job that is aligned with our growing workforce needs? Again, not just in energy, but of course in energy and every other sector.
And let's talk about some of those other sectors. I mean, one of the things you hear from a lot of employers in Colorado is that it's not that they don't have jobs they want to fill, so they can't find people to fill them. So as someone who has worked closely with our education system, look at Colorado's workforce pipeline, what are we lacking? What do we need to change to improve the ability to get people ready for jobs in the state?
We need, I'm very excited about programs like CareerWise, and certainly we don't want to lose any momentum from the Hickenlooper administration's pilot scale efforts to help get kids real life apprenticeship experience while they're in high school. A better conversation between community colleges and high schools is critical. And then making sure that we can, again, there's opportunities that exist today, but how can those be universal across all of our high schools rather than sort of hit or miss with regard to what kids encounter, which opportunities?
I have a question here,
Yes.
actually. So yesterday we had on Jamie Traficanda from Colorado Succeeds and Chris Brown with the CSPR, and they were talking about what if Colorado schools were number one. And I know that you were at that event to answer some of those questions. So they have a lot of programs and policies that they're looking at. What kind of budget would you figure in for those programs as much as you're into workforce development?
Well, education, we could easily talk the entire program about.
Yeah.
Really what we're highlighting in my campaign and my priority as governor will be quality early childhood education. Right now in the state, we only fund half-day kindergarten. Parents have to pay for full-day kindergarten themselves. If they want preschool, they have to pay for it themselves. There are a few slots through the Colorado preschool program for very, very low-income families. But if you're even close to middle class, you don't get that free. You have to pay for preschool and kindergarten. It's very, very expensive. So it's really an economic issue in terms of attracting a quality workforce with young families. You need to make sure that they have access to preschool and kindergarten. But it's also an educational issue. Every study shows that early childhood education is the most important years. If we truly care about these persistent achievement gaps based on race, based on geography, based on income, every child deserves a strong start. There's already an enormous difference in first grade. If for one kid it's their first full day in school, and the other kid has gotten the social, emotional learning skills and literacy skills of preschool and kindergarten. We are going to pay for that three ways. First is through, that will be, of course, my priority as governor from the general fund, and we hope to make a contribution significant from there. Second, we're already excited by the role of public-private partnerships in many communities. For instance, Adams 50 School District in Westminster, through a social impact bond mechanism, has been able to fund full-day preschool for all their children, and half-day preschool for half their kids, and full-day preschool for the other half. So they are 3/4 of the way there if you look at it that way. And again, they've done that by philanthropic investors that are willing to step up and be repaid through future savings in the system. So it turns out when you provide quality preschool and kindergarten, there's savings to the school districts. It reduces the special education rate. It reduces the grade repetition rate. It reduces the youth adjudication rate. And so that's another part of the model. And then third, I think, again, we would only go and ask for more if we show that we've been able to do everything we can with what we do. So we hope to get most of the way there with public-private partnerships and existing general fund revenues. And if there's anything else we need to do, of course, I'll be willing to roll up my sleeves and go to the voters and tell them the value that they're going to get and how it actually saves them money over time.
So one last thing on the funding question here. The first one you mentioned there, getting money from the general fund. Are you just hoping to use future growth, or are there areas in the general fund that you would like to cut in order to move some of this money toward education?
Sure. I certainly believe there's savings around criminal justice and incarceration. I think fundamentally from a justice perspective, we incarcerate too many people. We deal with mental health and substance abuse issues in a very costly way. And by the way, a very ineffective way, namely through our criminal justice system. When you talk to our sheriffs, our Jeffco County Sheriff, our Boulder County Sheriff, both of whom I've talked to in the last couple of months, they say a big part of what they're asked to do in the prison system would be better dealt with through a mental health system or substance abuse treatment. And again, we're paying more for it. It's very expensive when you're talking about the cell and the security and everything that goes in the prison environment. And of course, that's not what they're set up for. So I think there's substantial savings as we talk about drug abuse, first and foremost, as a health issue rather than as a criminal issue. I think there's great savings around saying, why can't we have preventative and ongoing access to mental health treatment services rather than wind up when people are committing petty crimes and winding up in prison, which is very costly.
We have about 30 seconds left here. Any thoughts before we go to break?
Well, you can learn more about my positions at polisforcolorado.com, including my plans for early childhood education, which I think is very important to the growth in the business environment, as well as important to the kids that it serves.
Wonderful. Stay with us here on Connect and Collaborate at cobrt.com/live. And be sure to like and subscribe our YouTube page. Check out this podcast and more for Finding Colorado's Next Governor at cobrt.com/press-release-FCNG. Thank you so much. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Connect and Collaborate. I am Alex Hopkins, your on-air producer. And once again, we have our very last episode of Finding Colorado's Governor. In studio, I have with me Ed Sealiver from Denver Business Journal. We have Congressman Jared Polis with us. And on the phone, we have President of the Colorado Business Roundtable, Jeff Walston. Jeff, go ahead and kick us off for this second segment.
Well, wonderful. Thank you. As we kind of get into our last segment of this great series that we've been running and talking with our candidates for governor and allowing the listeners in the Colorado constituency the opportunity to get to know each of the candidates and where they stand on some critical issues. Jared certainly kind of finished up talking a little bit about education, the competitiveness of our state, and the critical imperative that we face. And speaking of our state's competitiveness, I want to shift the conversation into economic development. And certainly Amazon has been making a lot of news, and Denver being in that final 20. A lot of discussion, though, around the incentives and how we balance, the use of taxpayer dollars toward attracting new business as it relates to supporting existing Colorado businesses and helping them grow and scale. So as you look at it coming into potentially the governor's office, how do you view economic development? What is that right role, the right use of incentives, and how do we ensure that all Colorado businesses across the verticals and industries can be successful?
Well, a governor is a ambassador for the state, and that goes with international trade missions, and it goes with attracting domestic employers to our state. It's a role that in many ways is native for me. I'm very excited to do that kind of outreach and certainly speak the language. I think what Coloradans want to make sure is that growth pays its own way. I don't think anybody wants to see businesses attracted where the cost for those of us already here are higher than the value of the business that is attracted, either in terms of roads or infrastructure or housing affordability or construction. So obviously with Amazon, that issue is writ large because it's tens of thousands of jobs, but it's no different than the issue when you're trying to attract any company of 200 or 400 or 1,000 people to the state. And as I said, it's a role I relish as governor.
Let's talk about one specific area where I know you have probably been more of a town crier, if you will, than anyone else, and that's the role of marijuana in our state. You've been a big advocate or a big supporter of legalized marijuana since it's come about. Talk about what you would do as governor to oversee and to promote, if you will, marijuana and hemp in our economic climate.
Well, I've long advocated legalization and leaving it up to local communities how they regulate it. I think it's regulate marijuana like alcohol is the name of the bill I've introduced federally. But I think when you look at the health impact of marijuana, it's it's not exactly the same, but it's analogous to alcohol. It's probably less chemically addictive than nicotine, which we sell in cigarettes, and by the way, less chemically addictive than alcohol too. Certainly, it has effects, particularly, can have negative effects in youth, and keeping it out of the hands of minors will certainly be a priority, just as it is for alcohol and cigarettes. I'm excited by the growth of the cannabis economy in our state, including industrial hemp. I visited industrial hemp farms on the Nebraska border. And I've, of course, worked with many of our legal, medical, and commercial dispensaries at the federal level to help them navigate a difficult regulatory environment. I think the challenge will be as more states come online, like California, obviously the 1,000-pound gorilla, and the other states that are moving towards commercial sale of marijuana. We will lose our specialness, we'll lose our distinctiveness, and we have to ask ourselves, what are those good, high-quality jobs in the cannabis industry where Colorado will be competitive in 5 years and 10 years? And I think a lot of them are going to be around the enabling technologies, point-of-sale systems, the chemistry products, and there's already Colorado companies leading the way. And I'll be excited as governor to work with any industry, certainly including the cannabis industry, to protect the public health and create good jobs.
I have a follow-up question on that. As you know, when it comes to the marijuana industry, a lot of the money you can't put into banks, right? And so what's happening is that the real estate's flooded now because people are paying cash and offering $40,000 more for asking prices. So I, in turn, can't buy a house as a millennial in Colorado. Is there any sense of relief? Are you working on anything there to make housing more affordable across the board?
Well, I think people are overestimating the effect of one industry. It probably has a little more effect on commercial. I'm not sure how it would have an effect on housing. They're not used to commercially produce marijuana, of course. They're not zoned for it or permitted for it. There's been, I think, a slight premium on warehouse space in some areas around grow operations in areas that permit them.
Oh, but, just to clarify,
yeah.
I am talking about owners investing in the real estate market in Denver. So yes, I am talking residential.
Yeah, I don't know any, marijuana owners that flush with money that they're buying, houses for cash. So I think it's a tough industry to make a profit in. They're not able to deduct their business expenses. They don't have the 280E deductibility. Okay. They pay an effective tax rate of often as high as 70%. So they can't deduct the cost of their payroll. Okay. They can't deduct no less the cost of goods sold, of course, right, which are federally prohibited. But they can't even deduct their legal business expenses. So, like in any new industry, they're pioneers. I'm sure there's some that are holding on, but there's certainly. And by the way, most of the industry is banked. It doesn't mean they don't live without worry and concern, and they don't get a letter and have to change their bank. But I would say, based on the knowledge I have of talking to people in the industry, probably about 70 to 80% of the industry has some form of banking.
I want to shift. Colorado voters recently had an opportunity to weigh on Amendment 69, Colorado Care, that was soundly defeated at the polls. But Jared, you just released a couple ads kind of doubling down, so to speak, on universal health care. Why do you think that's the right answer? And are there other things that you would do to improve the health care and access for all Coloradans if elected?
Yeah, Amendment 69, good concept, flawed execution, flawed policy. America is the only country in the industrialized world that doesn't have some form of universal care. And, I firmly believe that health care is a human right. And of course we can do this better. If you look at the biggest pain point that small businesses face, almost to a person, it's healthcare. I was talking to a small restaurant owner this morning, and she said, absolutely, healthcare is the biggest pain point. We cover our employees. It costs a lot. Those who are self-employed and small businesses and entrepreneurs not only have to contend with the high costs of healthcare, but also the administrative overhead associated with it. No other country puts their small businesses at that kind of disadvantage. We have a single payer in our country already. It's called Medicare. Certainly it's not perfect, but thank goodness we have it, or where would our seniors be today? So we propose a similar Medicare for all type model that I think would make Colorado a more attractive place to have a small business or a large business.
Now, one of the things in talking to physicians, talking to hospitals, they're not the world's biggest fan of Medicare because they say it barely covers, if it covers at all, their expenses in giving care right now. So are you proposing to repay doctors at Medicare rates? And if so, are you worried that we're just going to lose people from this industry?
So first of all, we use Medicare for all as a term to describe it. It's not exactly Medicare. Medicare is a federal product that is designed for seniors. So it would be a Medicare-like product at the state level with reimbursement rates negotiated with providers. You know what I hear from more and more doctors, more and more providers is, frankly, they're fed up with the insurance companies too. And the overhead that they save on processing costs, long times to payment, claims denied, the uncertainty around dealing with several insurers, frankly, is driving many private practices out of business altogether. They're consolidating. But also there's savings there for any practice. And so I think it's very reasonable to say, of course, if we can reduce their overhead, they should share some of that cost savings with the customers as well.
In the meantime, before we get to the idea of Medicare for all, because this is obviously not a quick turnaround process, are there ways that you would change state law regarding insurance, regarding practice, anything like that, to make sure that healthcare is not only more affordable, but more accessible to people?
I'm a big fan of pricing transparency, and that's both at the hospital level, the prescription drug level. One of the reasons that we have what I wouldn't hesitate to call a market failure in healthcare is because of the lack of a market. Even the most savvy consumer is effectively unable to price compare or make informed competitive decisions. Markets rely on information and rational behavior, and we need to do a better job making sure that provider fees that are negotiated are made public as are self-pay fees, so we can introduce more market elements to bring down rates within the healthcare infrastructure.
You, of course, have dealt a lot with technology. Colorado has a growing healthcare information technology sector right now. In what ways can we incorporate the businesses that are on the cutting edge, but not necessarily worked into most plans, worked into most mainstream healthcare in helping these goals?
We have a great healthcare technology sector. And again, I think there's a lot of savings to be had by more efficient information exchanges, more efficient processes around healthcare. We're thrilled to deploy that know-how, whether it's made here in Colorado or somewhere else, because it saves us money at the end of the day. I was long an advocate of repealing the medical device tax, which is inappropriately charged to many healthcare technology companies as well at the national level. But I am excited by the state of the healthcare technology industry here in Colorado. I think we really are reaching critical mass for another vertical market that will help serve Coloradans well, reduce costs, and provide good jobs.
And I'm going to ask one more healthcare before I turn Jeff over to talk about another topic here. Obviously, going to a Medicare for All type system would be extremely disruptive to an industry that, even if people grasp about the insurance industry, employs tens of thousands of people in Colorado. How do you make up for that loss in jobs if we're moving to fully government healthcare insurance?
Well, to be clear, insurance will still be there because many people will buy supplemental insurance on top of the basic package. Many Medicare recipients today have supplemental packages that they purchase or through their own retirement benefits have if they've spent a career at a particular office. So is it a smaller market for insurance? It is. But absolutely, they can show that they can add value. People will purchase insurance products. Employers will offer additional insurance to attract and retain the very best employees. But we'll have the basic level of care taking care of for everybody, just as we already do for all of our seniors.
Okay.
I want to shift the conversation quickly. I just introduced the president of Microsoft, Brad Smith, at this Western Pathways luncheon. And he was talking, obviously, about a topic that you're familiar with, technology, but in relation to access and rural broadband and ensuring that all students across the state, all business owners, have access to high-quality, efficient broadband. So what can you do as a governor to help ensure that all Coloradans have access to broadband that helps support homework, education, learning, business development, economic development?
So we have a plan for rural broadband at my website, polisforcolorado.com, including some work I did with some rural county commissioners to put that together. And the idea is about better leveraging our CDOT and school district infrastructure around meeting needs in areas of the states that are currently underserved. But if we really want to jumpstart the entrepreneurship and startup economy in Western Colorado, as well as empower location-independent employment, which doesn't just mean, of course, the high-end jobs like a programmer or an architect, but also many jobs that simply require a community college like a graphic artist. And yes, many jobs that simply require a high school degree like call center employees would be able to live in lower cost of living areas as long as they're interconnected. When we talk about infrastructure, we want to make sure it's not just moving people and cars, it's also moving bits and bytes. It's 21st century information infrastructure. It's a critical part of Colorado's competitiveness, and it's one that I look forward to helping to reach all of Colorado with.
What more then do we need to do? I mean, obviously the governor set aside a good deal of money this year for rural broadband. What more do we need?
I mentioned better leveraging the existing infrastructure within CDOT and school districts. We want to remove barriers to municipal broadband. We want to look at out-of-the-box solutions that can bring coverage to in a lower cost way to rural and remote areas. So we have a number of ideas, I think, in our tool shed, and it's not simply a question of dollars, it's also a question of policies and finding a way to get it done, because the benefit is there. By the way, there's also savings on physical infrastructure costs because you enable telecommuting and telemedicine, saving lives, saving money. And these are all benefits. So it's really something that we can't afford not to do as a state if we truly care about being able to tell a statewide story of economic success. We want to have an economy that works for everyone, not just metro area residents, not just the Front Range. And to do that, you can't leave any area out of the high-speed connectivity that's necessary for success in a 21st century economy.
Let's stay on the infrastructure, but shift specifically to transportation. Certainly there's potential of a couple ballot measures, one being ran by a business coalition led by the contractors, the Denver Chamber, and several other business and trade association groups looking at sales tax. Certainly Caldera and the Independence Institute have a bonding around Fix the Dam Roads. What is the right answer, Jared? In your mind, how do we address that? How do we ensure that mobility across the way, productivity, safety of our businesses, and certainly residents is all taken care of in a package under a Polis administration?
Well, this fiscal challenge may or may not fall to the next governor, as you indicated. Certainly we'll be watching attentively to see what the voters do this November. If we do have the chance to put an imprint on statewide infrastructure, I would say we would certainly make sure that my values that I bring are represented. I don't think you can simply look at lane expansion as a way out of this. You need to look at other forms of transportation, including bike commuting, including high-speed rail along the Front Range, and our proposal calls for Pueblo to Fort Collins rail. We really are one of the only metropolitan areas our size that doesn't have some kind of suburban high-speed rail commuting option, and I think we're all paying the price even more costly, both in lost productivity and traffic. I think the average productivity loss is $600 per person per year, and also in the huge infrastructure deficit that we have. And then as part of infrastructure, we also include rural broadband and connectivity, which we talk about. You can't leave that out either. So again, for me, it's wait and see. If it's left to the next governor, we'll be willing to roll up our sleeves and work with the business community, Republicans and Democrats, to deliver on what we need to keep the state competitive.
Where are you going to find money for high-speed rail? I mean, it's one thing to talk about finding money for early childhood education. That seems like a drop in the bucket compared to high-speed rail.
No, it's not. There's already a state legislature study group that's looking at the cost of high-speed rail. It is likely to be paid for, if I were to guess what the most likely funding mechanism would be, it would be a special district of the beneficiaries of Front Range Rail. I certainly don't think that residents outside the benefit area have any interest in paying for it. They'd still be able to ride it. They'd probably pay a higher cost for a ticket. We have a model. It would not likely be the existing RTD district either. That's a different geography. This is, again, would almost certainly include Metropolitan Colorado Springs, Metropolitan Pueblo. So, I look forward to working with the mayors of various cities, working with communities, and I think we have, 2, 3, 4 million people that would potentially be the direct beneficiaries of Front Range Rail. So it's of sufficient size to have a very minimal expense if they choose to move forward with it.
You talk about working with various people, and I just want to be blunt here. Show us how you can work across the aisle. I mean, I know that's
I think it's an area. Yeah, I think it's an area that I bring certainly more track record of success than any other candidates. I've built bipartisan coalitions. I was rated by a kind of objective scientific calculation and algorithm as being the most effective member of the Colorado congressional delegation in the House. And I'm a co-chair of the Bipartisan Outdoor Recreation Caucus, the Cannabis Caucus. You don't get anything done in a hyper-partisan place like Washington unless you work together. And so I have a successful track record of working with Republicans, independents, the business community to really think big and get things done. And a lot of what I've done in life has not been in the political arena, right? I've started public charter schools that serve new immigrants and help them learn English. I started a school for homeless youth in Denver. I've started businesses. And I think there's a lot of good ideas in our plan to get to 100% renewable energy that Republicans and Democrats will agree on. We have champions of preschool and kindergarten in our state legislature, some of whom are Republican, some of whom are Democratic. And, these aren't, I don't really think in terms of ideology or partisanship. I think in terms of moving our state forward.
Using that as a transition about working across the aisle, it's a great segue as I move into two different areas where I think we saw some bipartisan cooperation, one of them being on para and coming with a legislative solution to move that forward, and another one on fair districts, on the redistricting reapportionment process. Jared, what are your thoughts about the para fix and certainly the changes to how we deal with redistricting and reapportionment in the state that, again, will go to the voters this November?
Yeah, well, I'm thrilled they made progress on helping to end gerrymandering. Frankly, I think it would have also passed if it had been a citizens' initiative, so I'm kind of indifferent whether it was referred or it was a citizens' initiative. But I think that redistricting is one of the great failures of our democracy around allowing gerrymander districts, where all too often politicians choose their constituents rather than constituents choose their politicians. I'm also glad that Colorado led the way. I supported the initiative that allows our unaffiliated voters to vote in the primary of their choice. So if you're unaffiliated out there, I want to encourage you to return the Democratic ballot with a big checkoff on Jared Polis, because you will actually get both a Republican and a Democratic ballot. Not a lot of independents know that yet, right? It's the first time this is happening. So you will actually, unless you signed up for one party or the other, will get both ballots in the mail, and you'll be able to return the one of your choice. And I think it's great that certainly in my campaign, we're talking to independent voters early, because they're the same voters that we need to win in November. I do support, of course, preserving PARA as a defined benefit system. I don't think that any governor should play political games with the retirement savings of over 500,000 Coloradans.
Do you feel the PARA issue is done, or do you feel that the next governor needs to do more to shore this up?
Well, this is it's an actuarial calculation. It's certainly my understanding. I'm still studying the deal, but it's my understanding that even if what they did isn't exactly the deal that I would have put together, that it, at least according to preliminary figures I've seen, ensures the soundness of PARA for the next generation.
Before voters, and I'm going to take you back a little bit here as we wrap up the last couple of minutes. Before voters knew you as Congressman Jared Polis, I think a lot of people knew you as the primary proponent of Amendment 41, an initiative that, if people have forgotten those numbers, now that we're into the 60s and 70s, that was the amendment that limited the gifts that could be given to state employees. It was an amendment that had a lot of support, but also had a lot of trouble with the implementation. Talk about what you learned from that first experience and how that can carry into your governorship and the way you approach laws.
So I think it's why people like me or don't like me, is that I'm willing to challenge the status quo, take on the special interests. I'm the one who's willing to say, wait a minute, what do you mean lobbyists can give gifts to legislators or regulators who are in charge of it legally? That was allowed in our state, and we had a culture of it, and we had thousands of dollars legally trading hands, going to government regulators in charge of various industries, to state legislators of both parties, not with a quid pro quo. That would have been illegal. But how can you tell if there's a quid pro quo if you're getting a gift of thousands of dollars and then, you're voting a certain way? So it provided the appearance of impropriety. So I was glad to help author Amendment 41 to ban lobbyists from giving gifts, and also set up a statewide ethics commission. I have a longstanding interest in ethics. I serve on the ethics committee in Congress. I do think that we owe it to the people to have the very highest standards at the state level, and of course at the federal level too. I think we need to make sure that we're careful in writing laws, in our state constitution, but also statutory laws, to minimize any unintended consequences. But that should never be an excuse not to move forward. And again, if you want somebody who's going to shake things up a little, provide more transparency, more integrity, stronger ethics laws, I'm your guy. If you like the loosey-goosey, under the table, smoke-filled room deals, I'm probably not your guy.
Yeah, we've got time for probably one more. I'm going to give a chance and try to put a bow around this series. First and foremost, to our listeners, thanks for tuning in as we've embarked upon this year-long series talking with our candidates running for governor. Ed, thank you, and to the DBJ for your partnership along the way. Jared, we've got about a minute left. You're entering into a primary. Ballots will be out soon. What's your last pitch to the voters? You slid in very tactfully a plug to the independents out there. Well done. But what separates you from your opponents, from Kerry, from Senator Mike Johnston, from the Lieutenant Governor Donna Lynn?
Thanks, Jeff. And by the way, we don't just want the votes of your independents out there. Those Democrats out there listening, here's your chance to elect a Democrat with a business background, created hundreds of jobs, raised capital in public and private markets, passionate about capital creation, and across the life of businesses. I think I bring the skill set and having accomplished big things here in our state. Started schools that have served thousands of students. In fact, one of New American Schools graduation is just coming up in the next few days. And I'm excited to tackle the next challenge. We're going to do some amazing things here in Colorado. With all the uncertainty and the mess coming from Washington, we need to think big right here in Colorado. You can learn more about me at polisforcolorado.com. I'm Jared Polis, and would be honored to have your vote on the Democratic ballot in the next week.
Thank you so much for joining us today, gentlemen. It's been great. Find more at cobrt.com.